It may have been a little tough to see at first, but this tire has a wobble to it. So we're going to be going through today in the Larson garage and diagnosing, is it something with the wheel and tire itself? Is it something with the axle? Sort of what's going on with it, and then how are we going to go through and fix it? So the first thing we're going to do is swap the driver's side tire with the passenger side tire to see, does the wobble move to the passenger side or does it stay on the driver's side? So this is after we swapped the tires. Even though the whole Jeep is rocking, you can tell this one's pretty straight. Let's go take a look at the other one. I don't need to hang a string to know that this one's bent, or to see that this side of the axle is what the issue is. So, since we didn't see the wobble on the passenger side before, it might be something with the axle. And since the passenger side now doesn't have a wobble, we know it's not that rim. We'll take the tires off, start to look into deeper what's really going on here. Alright, so now that we have the tire off, we pulled the drum off as well and put a straight edge here. So as we spin it, we can see there's a little bit of sway on this mounting flange, which is obviously why we see, it's maybe 1/8 of an inch here, but when you get the tire on it, it really starts to get a good wobble in it. So what we're going to do now, we'll pull the axle shaft out, have a look at that, and then see, is the axle shaft bent, or is something, obviously something's up with this axle. It's either this hub flange itself is bent, or the shaft maybe has a twist in it that's causing that wobble that we're seeing. Alright, so I have the driver's side axle shaft pulled out, starting to look at it. There's a couple of things we're going to look at with this. The first one being the splines at the end, are those still straight? Which these seem to be. I have a couple examples that I'll show with where the splines are not straight and what can happen there. And the other thing is this, what we're going to check is the shaft still sort of running true? So we have a flat plate here, I got a light, so I'm just going to run it on the plate and then see, do I get any light underneath? Am I seeing as it rolls there's sort of a hump in it? Sometimes it can be tough to see with the eye. Alright, so now looking at the splines for that axle shaft that we just pulled out, like I said, they look pretty straight. Can't really see any twisting going on there. But if we look over here at another shaft I have, you can clearly see, what we're talking about with where the splines that are engaged stay straight, but where the splines that stick out from what's engaged, you'll start to see that there's a twist in them, in that movement. So that means that this part of the shaft is spun in relation to the rest of this spline. So that's one of the things we're looking at. So the next thing, like I said, we'll look at the rest of the shaft. Alright, so now we have the axle shaft up here. So as we roll it, we can start to see that light's coming through underneath the axle shaft, which tells us there's a gap between this plate and the shaft itself. So that means that there's a slight bend in this axle shaft. Now, after seeing the damage to the driver's side shaft that we have, I decided to pull the passenger shaft and have a look at that as well, and ran the same test with rolling it on the plate, and noticed the same thing. So there's light coming through on this passenger side shaft as well, and I can see the splines are just slightly starting to twist. So now that I know both of these axle shafts are no good, obviously I need to put some new ones in. Now I do have another set of stock Scout axle shafts, but this is now, with these two, that's 4 original shafts that I've damaged, either bent or twisted splines on. So I'm not going to put sort of the same strength axle shafts back in just to do this again and pull it out maybe later this year or next year. So I'll get a set of chromoly axle shafts ordered up, we'll get those put in, and then we'll get this rear end all buttoned up. Alright, so about 3.5 seconds ago I just said I'm not going to put factory axle shafts back in the CJ. But that's exactly what I'm going to be doing. So I did order chromoly axle shafts. Apparently the Scout axle, it's a unique dimension between the bearing face and the flange because of the drum brakes. So with it being somewhat of a unique measurement, there's only essentially that I could find one supplier that makes them in actual chromoly. There's a lot that make them in 1541, which is a higher grade steel, stronger than the factory axles, but not quite as strong as chromoly. So I ordered them in late March. Should have been shipping mid-May, early May, which has come and gone. And now the update is they'll be shipping in August. So I'm not going to leave the CJ in here till August. I'm going to throw these back in. They should hold up for the season. And then we'll throw the chromoly axle shafts in once we get them. So in the meantime, we'll go through, put new bearings and seals on these, get them cleaned up, get them at least degreased. I have three shafts, so we'll take a look, try and pick the best two. Then we'll get them thrown in and get the rear end all back together. So when I'm going through and cutting these bearings off, I'm not actually cutting the whole way through. So there's a bearing and then the bearing retainer, but I only cut about 3/4 of the way through, and then I take a chisel and strike it, and it splits or cracks just enough to then be able to get this off of the axle shaft. If you cut all the way through, you can risk actually scoring the axle shaft itself, which you wouldn't want to do. And right at the edge of the axle shaft is where that seal is going to ride. So you definitely don't want to nick that, because then you'll never get it to seal, and there's really no way to repair it. Alright, so now that we have the old seals and bearings and bearing retainers off, we're at the press. We're going to start putting the new ones on. So the first thing that's going to go on is that outer seal. So I already have just some white lithium grease on the axle shaft. I'll also put some on the inside of the seal. Alright, so we'll slide the seal on. And obviously, before the sealer, I didn't mention we have the backing plate. And this is what actually bolts to the axle and keeps everything in place. So now that we have the seal in place, we're going to put the bearing on. So we'll slide that on, and this is what we're going to press in place. So now to press this in, I also have that old bearing retainer that we cut off the old axle shaft, or cut off of this. And so I'm going to use this to press, to actually press on to press this bearing down, rather than pressing directly onto the bearing. So now we'll load it into the press this down, and then we'll press on the new bearing retainer. Alright, so we're all set to throw the axle shaft in. I did put just a little bit of RTV on the outside of that seal. I went in and cleaned this, got any oil, pulled the old race out. So we're all set to throw it in, and then just a little bit of grease on the splines just to help it ease it into the locker. So what I was looking for is that the seal has gone in square, and it's not hanging out at a funny angle before I start to tighten down that backing plate. In the past, I've done it where I've gotten it close and sucked it in with the backing plate, filled the axle all up with oil, and then it started dripping out because I had crushed that seal. So you really want to make sure that you do it, that you pay attention with that, because speaking from experience, it's not really that fun. You get all the way to this point, and then realize you just have to cut off that new bearing and race that you just put on, and essentially throw them out and start over again. So, but we should be good on this one. So we'll jump over to the other side, throw that axle shaft into. So we got the axle shaft in, got the drum back on it. We'll throw the tires on now, run it, do the same thing we did when we first brought it in here, and see how the back wheels look. Hopefully, I mean, fingers crossed that there's no wobbles. There might be a slight bit. I mean, these are factory original, I mean, close to 50-year-old axle shafts, so, but I'm hoping it's much better than what it was when we brought it in here. Otherwise, all this work was for nothing. So let's see. Alright, so I'm happy with what we just saw. No more extreme wobble in either of the wheels. So I'm happy with that. I'm happy that these old shafts are still straight, or straight enough for what we're doing here. I guess this is part one. There'll be a part two when we actually get those chromoly shafts. We'll be pulling these out and putting those in. But I gotta get back to work on the Jeep. There's a few more odds and ends. We're getting closer to getting it out on the road, getting it out on the trails. Thank you for taking the time and watching this video. If you learned something or enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, like it. But I gotta get back to work on this now. Thanks. Bye.